And, I'm here to do a really important thing, which is introduce the Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of the Witwatersrand to all of you. You are all here, as you know, for the 2023 South Africa Conversations, which are co-organized by the Holberg Prize and the Innovation Foundation for Democracy, hosted right here at WISA at WITS. So, without further ado, Professor Zeblon Vilakazi is the Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of the Witwatersrand. That is so much better. Thank you. He was instrumental in establishing South Africa's first experimental high-energy physics research group at CERN, working on the Large Hadron Collider, where he was involved in the development of the Alice detector high-level trigger. Vilakazi has fostered international collaborative research as director of Ithemba Labs, the largest cyclotron facility in the Southern Hemisphere, where he initiated a flagship rare isotope beam, also known as RIB project. In 2019, he played a role in securing a place for African academic partners in the development of practical applications through access to the IBM Quantum Computing Network. He has served on various advisory boards, including amongst others the IAEA, the IUPAP, which is the International Union of Pure and Applied Physics, and the Joint Institute for Nuclear Research. In May 2022, Professor Zeblon Vilakazi was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society of London. Without further ado, I'd like to ask our Vice Chancellor, Professor Vilakazi, to come up.
Thank you, Kendall. I was working gingerly here, being a nerd, with all the contraptions I might trip. So if I trip, please don't laugh. I think that's the price you get for having a nerd running over these events. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good evening to you all. To the leadership, past and present, of this august and pioneering flagship institute of the Global South, namely the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research. Professor Sarah Natal, Professor Hlenipa Mokoena, Professor Keith Breckenridge, Ms. Najiba Deshmukh, Professor Achille Mbembe, to our visitors from the University of Bergen in Norway, Professor Jørgen Sejersted, Chairperson of the Holberg Prize, Professor Bjorn Bertelsen, and Ms. Ellen Hayter. We've got distinguished visitors as well from Harvard University at Cambridge, United States, Professor Sheila Jasanoff, the latest laureate of the Holberg Prize, which was awarded last year. Congratulations. And I also recognize Professor J. Jasanoff as well. Colleagues from the University of the Witwatersrand, the University of Pretoria, the University of Bergen in Norway, who are here joining us online. I want to welcome you all to WISA for the 2023 South Africa Conversation. This event is the result of a very promising collaboration between the Holberg Prize in Norway and the Innovation Foundation for Democracy here in Johannesburg, South Africa, directed by our very own Achille Mbembe. This event is taking place here at WISA, our flagship humanities research institute, as I mentioned before, which has distinguished itself from its infancy more than 2 decades ago to be the forefront center for cutting-edge research in the humanities of the Global South. Indeed, before I introduce tonight's speakers, let me say a few words, please allow me, about our university's contribution to the advancement of social sciences and humanities research locally and globally. And I'm saying this as a scientist because, there has been over the last few years, as you might have heard, in various platforms about the whole thing around quantum computing and the threats presented by AI, that even in the West, there's been a move towards focusing on STEM. But we take pride in keeping our eye on the ball of ensuring that we remain central in pursuing the studies of what it means to be human in this era of machines. And this place will be right at the heart of it, and will be exemplified by the presentation you'll have in a short while. And we are proud at WITS to remain in the forefront of this laboratory for social sciences, which is Johannesburg. So it is therefore clear that WITS is increasingly being recognized as a nodal point for international academic institutions on critical theory. As I mentioned earlier, from the lens of humanities on science and technology studies, on oceanic humanities, studies of the Indian Ocean, studies of the literatures of the Anthropocene, and various attempts at decolonizing theory. Furthermore, an increasing amount of WITS scholars are published every year by the prestigious academic universities presses, both in the global north and here in South Africa and in the global south, to mention among others our venerated WITS University Press. Indeed, few of our scholars in critical theory and philosophy are here today and are among the most sought after thinkers in the world. They have been awarded significant international prizes and recognitions, and their books have been translated in dozens of foreign languages, Norwegian included, dear friends. Therefore, getting on to the program, I'd like to introduce the chair of the Holberg Prize, Professor Jürgen Seyerstedt from the University of Bergen. Professor Jürgen Magnus Seyerstedt is a professor of Nordic literature at the University of Bergen, Norway. He is also the chair of the Holberg Prize from this year, early this year, 2023, and a former dean of the Faculty of Humanities at Bergen. The role he played from 2017 to 2021. Seyerstedt was a project leader for the ideologies of Holberg from 2012 to 2016 and chairman of the Norwegian management group for the web text project of collected works of Ludwig Holberg from 2010 to 2015. He also chaired the Norwegian Society of the 18th Century Studies from 2014 to 2015 and was a leader of the University of Norway Humanities Strategic Unit from 2019 to 2021. I invite you, Professor Seyerstedt, to say a few words on behalf of the Holberg Prize. Please.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Vice Chancellor Vilakazi. So, distinguished professors and Vice Chancellor, dear colleagues and friends, it's a great pleasure for us in the Norwegian Holberg Prize to come here to great city of Johannesburg and co-host this event together with the Innovation Foundation for Democracy and to be hosted by Weiser and WITS. My name, as you heard, is Jürgen Seyerstedt, and I am the chair of the Holberg Board and professor of Nordic Literature at the University of Bergen. And on behalf of the Holberg Board, I would like to thank the University of Witwatersrand and Vice Chancellor Professor Zeblon Vilakazi for hosting this event. And of course, thank you, Weiser, the WITS Institute for Social and Economic Research, where we now find ourselves. Further, I would like to thank Professor Achille Mbembe, director of this Innovation Foundation for Democracy, for co-organizing these events and contributing to the coming discussions. Further, I wish to thank all the discussants and participants in all the events, and of course I have to especially offer the thanks of the Holberg Prize Board to our laureate of 2022, as you heard, Professor Sheila Jasanoff. We are really delighted, Sheila, that you have found the time in your busy schedule to come here and meet with us in this very fascinating place and participate so extensively in the events. Thank you very much. And last but not least, I will thank you all, representatives of the South African academic community, for taking time to follow and participate in this event. This is very much appreciated. So the Holberg Prize is one of the largest, I'll tell you a little bit about the prize. It's one of the largest international prizes awarded to outstanding scholars in the humanities, social sciences, law, and/or theology. The prize was established by the Norwegian government in 2003 in homage to the 18th century scholar Ludvig Holberg. You can see a representation of his face over there. Doesn't resemble him very much, I think, but anyway. Holberg is today totally unknown outside Scandinavia, but he wrote in the natural law perspective of German scholar Samuel Pufendorf, a perspective which I think is still relevant as it strives to balance the idea of universal truths against cultural and historical singularities. And it always finds itself in some close and critical dialogue with the radical ideas of early Enlightenment. But apart from the name, however, the prize itself entails no connection to the works of Holberg. The Holberg Prize is administered by the University of Bergen on behalf of the Norwegian Ministry of Education and Research. And the prize, it holds a value of approximately 500,000 euros. And this year, 2023, marks the 20th anniversary of the prize. And to us in the Holberg Prize organization, these events is part of our anniversary celebrations. However, these events in South Africa are also important, as we would like to make the Holberg Prize more relevant at a global level. We therefore see these discussions in South Africa as one small step toward making the prize known and relevant within an increasing number of global academic contexts. The Holberg Prize is awarded by the board on behalf of the University of Bergen and on the recommendation of an independent international academic committee, which consists of outstanding scholars from the relevant academic fields. The work of the committee is based on nominations coming in from institutions and scholars in the relevant fields. Anybody who works in an academic capacity at an academic institution can register a nomination. And as the board is very eager to make the Holberg Prize even more globally relevant and enhance the reputation of the prize internationally, we are dependent on nominations coming in from all over the world. The laureates of the Holberg Prize for 2024 will be publicly announced on the 14th of March. However, for the Holberg Prize for 2025, we strongly encourage nominations to be submitted through the website of the Holberg Prize until the deadline of 15th of June. So please check out our website. It's a lot of information you'll find there on the prize and the prize winners, and also other activities of the Holberg Prize organization. But now we greatly look forward to the keynote and to follow these South African conversations on the implications of technological, political, and societal changes. So I will spend no more of your time, but hand the word back to Vice Chancellor Vilakazi. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Soyestad, for really stating something, and I just want to refer to your one small step. But I can add a bit, using a cliche now, but it's a giant leap for the advancement of humanities and social sciences. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Sheila Jasanoff and Professor Achille Mbembe, starting with Professor Jasanoff, who is a full-time Professor of Science and Technology Studies, STS, at the Harvard Kennedy School. She's a pioneer in the social sciences and explores the role of science and technology in law, politics, and policy of modern democracy. Jasanoff founded and directs the STS program at Harvard University. As I mentioned earlier, she was awarded the Holberg Prize in 2022. Among her works are her books on, number one, the fifth branch that she published in 1990, Science at the Bar in 1995, Design on Nature, 2005, The Ethics of Invention, in 2016, and the latest, Can Science Make Science of Life, which is left with a question mark, that she published in 2019. Distinguished Professor Holberg, Professor Jasanoff, we look forward to hearing about your lecture.
First of all, thank you, Vice Chancellor. Thank you, Vice Chancellor, for the welcome and for that kind introduction. Thank you to the Holberg Institution, both for the signal honor of awarding me the prize last year in 2022, and even more so for the unexpected pleasure of being able to discuss some of these issues that have been central to my work in a context where I think they will resonate very differently from the way they do back home, partly because the scholarship and the perspectives from the Global South on questions of science and technology and on the globalization that has been, in a way, driven forward by science and technology, looks very different from the places where science and technology land and the places where science and technology have their cradle. And I think that those differences have not been sufficiently theorized and explored. And the honor of being with globally recognized scholars like Professor Achille Mbembe and Sarah Nuttall of this very institution, WISER, but also Dilip Menon, Keith Breckenridge, and many others who will be involved in this conversation, is just an opportunity of a sort that I could not hope to create for myself. So I'm extremely grateful, honored, and delighted to be here with you all. And one thing I would like to stress is that the rewards of this occasion will come from the fact that it'll be conversations and hence exchanges and not one person holding forth in some way. But we also know that to have any kind of a conversational atmosphere going, somebody has to take the first step, and whether it's serving the appetizers and the drinks or producing some kind of thing called a keynote, an odd sort of invention of our academic society and culture, somebody has to take that first step. It's often a step into the unknown because neither the organizers nor the performers in the script really know exactly what's going to come forward, and you're forced to provide a title way ahead of time, and then you're filling in the title with some content, but by then things have changed in the world and you want to say something a little different from what you said the title was about. So, I think that the conversational dimension that's going to unfold over the next 3 days will really be the heart and soul of the occasion, and I'm looking forward to that much more than to my appetizer piece that I will serve up shortly. But just to contextualize at least the Constitutions 2.0 part of the title, I've been thinking about constitutionalism in connection with science and technology studies for quite a long time now. We're all used to the idea, and certainly here in South Africa, you're used to it more recently than we in the United States, that there is a thing, a coming together, a document, a set of principles, things that people agree to live by that get called constitutions. And today, when we went to the Apartheid Museum, and at the end of the all too compressed tour, took a little stone and threw it across a kind of bridge from one side to the other as a kind of reaffirmation of a set of beliefs about collective well-being, about the fact that one may wish to live in an ordered society that actually conforms to the, is it 9 pillars that represent the South African Constitution, I mean, this idea was in my mind all over again in a very different context. What we're much less concerned about, and in a sense have not thought about nearly so long as we've thought about political constitutions, is the ways in which science and technology actually constitute our lives every bit as deeply as the principles that we commit to, and very often the principles that we're building into our scientific and technological creations and constructs are not articulated anything like as explicitly or in as great detail as the things that sit in political documents such as a Bill of Rights. So around new developments in technology, some people have actually started using words like Bill of Rights and Constitution. So NGOs, for instance, in America that have dealt with genetic modification have been talking about things like a genetic Bill of Rights. Are you entitled to some set of protections just because we now know that you're a biological entity and you have genes, and these genes to some extent circumscribe what kind of people you are or what kind of a person you are, who your progeny will be, and so on and so forth. In a less noted development, the digital moguls and empires of California's Silicon Valley have started talking about constitutions, but these are constitutions around questions of what kind of content can actually pass in digital space. And so they are busily engaged in creating sets of principles by which we, the consumers, will either be able to express our thoughts in digital space or have our thoughts filtered or have information filtered in some sense before it reaches us, to avoid the kinds of harms that might be caused through unlimited exchanges of ideas on the internet. And one can very definitely debate all of these ideas about where does an organization like OpenAI, which we didn't even know existed, 9 months ago, get its idea of constitutionalism from. But this is just to give you an example of the way in which, to some degree, constitutions in the imagination of the techies and the nerds, Vice Chancellor, has escaped quite out of the box of constitutional documents that are sitting in the National Archives in the United States. There's a kind of fertility to the idea of constitutions that is to some extent belied by the institutions that we have in the world, where there's a written text, and the text has a body of people, and we know what those institutions are like. When you turn to digital or scientific constitution making, the world is much more fluid. And in a way, Achille, it is a space of innovation, but they don't know they're doing democracy, and so we have to engage in conversations in order to parse out something about where these developments ought to be headed. So with that, by way of introducing the sort of conceptual underpinnings of what I want to talk about, let's turn to the digital space, where some of this evolution of who we are, what we should read, write, and think, where do we get our information, what sort of affiliations should we form, what is protected space. All of these things are being discussed in a very vigorous way. So as probably all of you know, one of the reasons that this has gained such a high position, such an elevated position in our discourse, is the unveiling of these large language models or generative AI, approximately a year ago, and already it's entered all of our lives. I'd be curious to know to what extent this penetration goes as deep as it goes inside American academia. But from the beginning, it's cast in America in characteristically American terms. Innovation is always a race. There are always going to be winners and losers, and we've always got to be in the forefront and ahead. And the discourse has already shaped up around these ideas. I'm sure that the visual arts-oriented people among you would have something to say about the gaze of the people looking out. But for the moment, I'll just let you consider whether these are real people or not. I think they are real people. But just within a few short weeks, a couple of months, this is a whole set of headlines that start appearing all over our newspapers, and everybody's on the case. I mean, from Noam Chomsky onwards. I mean, is it the chatbots who are the subject, or Elon Musk, or Noam Chomsky? I mean, it gives you a kind of varied spin around a world in which suddenly everybody's involved in talking about AI. And lest we think it's only those people who are making it or the media, this is a selection of quotations that I took from approximately 9 months of just getting documents of a sort from my administration that I normally would trash, but I kept them as research materials because I thought at some point I might like to go back and sort of look at the origins. And the origins are interesting because from the beginning, there's this complete unquestioning assumption that because this tool is there, we must bow to it. We must embrace it. We must figure out what its potentialities are. We must adopt it into our teaching and training methods. We must teach our students. And, one of the most recent things I got was in support of enabling responsible experimentation. That's the very last bullet point. With generative artificial intelligence tools, we're pleased to announce that the Harvard Generative AI Sandbox pilot is now available. So there's even a free sandbox. Now, sandbox is obviously a creation of the innovation economy, and everybody who does innovation knows what it is. I too know what it is. My kids used to play in sandboxes. But, we're in effect being invited into a new age of infantilization so that we can keep up with these amazing tools that people have laid out in front of us. But note the assumption that the things are there, they're already tools, and it's up to us to use them responsibly. The question, should we use them? Should we generate these tools? What should the limits be on the production of tools? None of that is there. And this is in the same season that is watching Christopher Nolan produce Oppenheimer, okay? Which is definitely a story that tells a different kind of fable about the uncontrolled embrace of tools and looking backward. Do we consider ourselves destroyers of the world, or do we consider ourselves enablers and prophets of a new future? So there's no sense, and these are documents that are being produced within the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, so one of the premier institutions for thinking about public policy. There's no sense that there's a discourse of limits that might go along with the discourse on possibilities, or very little sense. So it's more effective teaching and learning, how to use this powerful new tool. I mean, note that it's already in the toolkit that we must all now put into our backpacks and carry around. So to the extent that a new infrastructure is being laid down, we are being trained to become the plumbers of that infrastructure and must use these tools. Okay, so now, where does this leave us as people? And, the Vice Chancellor and others talked about the fact that one of WISE's missions is to actually think about the place of the human in contemporary life and from a humanistic and social science perspective. So we also have been talking about the fact that the conversations that we have here and also around innovation often have long roots, and this is why there are historians in this room and involved in thinking about these kinds of issues. So although ChatGPT is new and Anthropic and other large language models, worrying about how human beings relate to machines is not in itself new. So according to one account, and I'll get into it a little more deeply, Sigmund Freud was one of the people who started thinking about the way in which technological innovation produces discontinuities in human experience. And this is from a book by a historian named Bruce Maslow. I'll come back to him in a second. But he says in his book called The Fourth Discontinuity that Freud, in one of his lectures, referred to two other moments of discontinuity and then placed himself as the third. And these moments were initiated by Copernicus, the figures of Copernicus, Darwin, and Freud himself. And each one was a displacement moment. So Copernicus took the Earth away from being the center of the solar system, which was a displacement. Darwin took human beings away from being at the pinnacle of creation, and Freud saw himself as destabilizing the conscious mind and making clear that behind the conscious mind is an unconscious that is also driving us, and hence destabilizing reason itself as we understand it with the surfaces of our mind. And this language he is not even master in his own house has resonated with me, because it is a decentering of sovereignty. It's the kind of sovereignty that Kant imagined when we, Immanuel Kant that is, when we become enlightened and become sovereigns over, as adults, mastering our own intellect. That is the kind of Enlightenment idea of sovereignty over the self that is, to some extent, being undermined through this, this set of discoveries about the solar system, about evolution, and about psychoanalysis. So Maljević wrote between, let's say, the late 1960s and the mid-1990s, and eventually in book form, about the fourth discontinuity, which you see there. And for him, there was a fourth discontinuity setting in. And the fourth discontinuity was about the relationship between humans and their machines. And he put this in a normative frame. How should we behave in relation to these machines? Are we to repeat the real Frankenstein story by turning from the monsters we have created, but does that also involve turning away from our own humanity? Or alternatively, do we accept the blow to our ego, but the blow to our ego now, because the very clear distinction between human and machine is no longer going to be observed. We are ourselves machines. The machines we're building are also human, and therefore that dividing line is being erased, again decentering our particularity as human beings. Those of you in this room who are familiar with the work of Bruno Latour may recognize an earlier version of his injunction to love our monsters that he wrote about in an essay for the Breakthrough Institute, but Maljević was writing this a couple of decades earlier. And then the last sentence there, in taking the latter path, the one that erases or diminishes our differentiation from the machine, I am arguing, this is Maljević, that then we would be free to reconfigure the relationship in various ways, and I would like to attend to the various for the rest of our talk, because, for there is, of course, no single right way. And this is almost an echo of religion here, because there is no single right path to our future evolution together with the machine. And Maljević also talks about other people long before him who talked about the way in which one might then write technological history as human history as well. And he talks about how Marx refers to Darwin and suggests that evolutionary history could equally be written in terms of technological evolution and not just the evolution of the biological human. And we already see, evidence that evolutionary history can be written in this way. My first job when I was in college one summer was to work for the teleprompter company, and I used to commute from Scarsdale, New York, where my family lived, to New York, and the offices were located next to Grand Central Station. I didn't know I was partaking in a revolution. I had to do something like sort punch cards. But originally I was doing something clerical, and I remember getting promoted and my salary being doubled when it turned out I could handle punch cards. But it's only in retrospect that I remember all this. The clearest thing I remember is the joke that the mailman used to make, because every time he delivered the mail after lunchtime, he would say, "Life has its ups and downs," because he was coming up in the elevator and going down in the elevator. I mean, this was the kind of environment that I was doing this in. So we didn't know that we would have those little shiny gadgets that are down below there. And, this has already permeated, people's thinking about evolution in other sorts of ways. So when we think of the Darwinian evolutionary diagram, that very well-known one where humans are eventually shown standing up and walking, this is the Maslish moment, because now, or the Marx moment, if you will, because what is inside the human, Jay, my companion of 60 years, was watching Star Wars on our way here, and I was watching not listening, but watching the sort of awkward movements of C-3PO. And you could sort of imagine is it a C-3PO that we're developing, or something that walks with the stride of an American Western actor. But one of the interesting things to note is that, theorists can talk all they like, but in the meantime, there are actors in the world who are actually enacting some forms of theory without knowing that they're doing this. And a number of years ago already, in 2014, one of the first interesting constitutional law cases about our relationship to our machines came out in the form of a Fourth Amendment litigation, Fourth Amendment being about unreasonable searches and seizures. So the question was, can a cell phone be searched without a search warrant? And Chief Justice Roberts, known as one of the leaders of the now supermajority of right-of-center intellectuals and judges in America, wrote the opinion. These are not people who are soft on crime, but the majority decided in that case that cell phones could not be searched without a warrant. And a warrantless search, saying you can't do it, is a big deal for a rule of law-oriented judiciary. And it's interesting just to highlight what he said. Why? Because they have become such a pervasive and insistent part of daily life that the proverbial visitor from Mars might conclude they were an important feature of human anatomy. So, here he's sort of accepting the Maslish articulation of machine and human becoming hybridized. And, I don't think he's read Donna Haraway or Cyborgs or, anything like that. But there he is, sort of play-acting theory in ways that are consequential for human life in some sense. All right, so a couple of words about how an STS scholar trained like me in law might then want to think about these developments. So one of the things that Science and Technology Studies has been doing for some length of time is noting that law operates as a social technology, and therefore asking about law some of the same questions that a constructivist thinker might ask about the social construction of other kinds of technological systems, and to some extent using the vocabulary of science and technology studies and the methods of science and technology studies to think about and write about legal disputes. So I myself wrote an article quite a long time ago now called "What Judges Should Know About the Sociology of Science," and I suggested that the judiciary really ought to be educated in some of these concepts that are second nature to STS scholars, because what they're seeing in the courtroom, in effect, is a social construction, often of technological systems, but always around disputes. So a method, a tried and true method in STS, is controversy studies. If you want to understand how social ideas get built into technological systems, go to the moment where these things are still in flux and see what alternative ideas people brought to the table at that time. You get empirical evidence. You don't need to theorize. It's actually laid out before you. But in that sense, the law is a ripe field for controversy studies, because legal cases begin with controversy. and good advocates are always reading the matter in dispute from radically different points of view. So one person is arguing that a former president of the United States has committed financial fraud. Another person is arguing, no, 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 these are ordinary business practices and there was nothing fraudulent about them. So there's interpretive flexibility, there's boundary work. Does it belong on this side or the other? Is it a living thing? Someday we will be considering whether a large language model has entitlements of the sort that human beings do. We haven't quite got there yet, but these are things that one can imagine. And where does responsibility end? People are already discussing this with self-driving cars. So a self-driving car crashes into somebody, injures them severely, or kills them. Where was the intent? Was it in the maker of the car? Was it in the car itself? What does it mean to punish a cyborg entity where you don't know where the boundary is between the human and the non-human? So in that sense, STS has been thinking about law and its technological dimensions for a long time. But I would argue that conventional STS has to some extent been stuck on the productionist side of thinking about science and technology and innovation. So SSK here stands for the Sociology of Scientific Knowledge, a particular school of thought in STS. But SSK for a long time, Sociology of Scientific Knowledge, has been interested in how the facticity of the world comes about. What counts as a fact? And then it looks at the production of those facts, at the ways in which facts get deconstructed, at the micro level of how a particular claim, such as, for instance, the nature of gravity waves, comes into being in a field that may be highly technical, like physics, like the sorts of things discussed at CERN, but how do people resolve those disputes? So in the end, you know that the Higgs boson exists, for instance. So, these are real sociological questions that people can ask, or anthropological questions, by sitting around with the people who are doing that work. When do you have certainty? Why was Linus Pauling wrong when he said 3 strands make up DNA, and how did the double helix come to assume the canonical status that it does? For scientists, the answer is often obvious. It was true. That was how nature was. But for the social studies student of science, that's not really true. It came about because people stopped disagreeing at a certain moment and said, okay, enough is enough. But that statement that enough is enough may work for everybody, or it may work for a subset. So think about all of the disputes around the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance. Do people agree that masking is good for you or bad for you? And if so, where and when? Do they agree that school closings were a good idea or a bad idea? I mean, these things probably never will be settled, just as what caused World War I will never be settled, but, will always be open to multiple interpretations. However, I think that a different set of questions needs to be asked by STS scholars and by all of us thinking together and conversing together, that starts at the normative end and asks not what makes a fact, but how do social orders achieve the sorts of durability that they sometimes have? Or the opposite, what makes a social order fragile is every bit as interesting a question. And then facts may enter into the discussion there because for a long time, until very recently, we accepted that gender comes in binary form and not in fluid and multiple forms. By we, I mean in the Anglophone, Judeo-Christian tradition. In India, I think the idea of gender was always more fluid, and there's much more in the way of polymorphism in Indian iconography and a different place for people who have transgender roles in society, for instance. So I think that even that question of who's the we that's deciding what are the categories becomes a very important thing. And I think this is an opening for a global South imagination that really has a very different starting point. You would never get there if you stayed stuck onto what makes a fact, because you'd be talking the talk of the people who are making the facts, and you wouldn't be talking about the people who are making the norms, and you would be coming from a different end. And I think that if you, in that sense, decolonize STS by not following the science, again, to invoke the late and extremely eminent science studies scholar and former Holberg Prize winner, Bruno Latour, one of his very simple methodological mandates was, how do you do STS? You follow the scientist. And legions of STS scholars have done that. They follow the scientist. It is a very important method, but you may not go to the subtleties of what makes science and social order together cohere, or technology and social order, if you only follow the scientists. There are other things to follow as well. So I think that that is another of the sort of starting points for the sort of discussion that I think, you know, could arise with us for here. So democracy is another word that's on the table, not least because of Achille's efforts to put innovation and democracy together. I think that is a kind of hybridization, Achille, because science and technology have so captured the word innovation that it's refreshing to see democracy recapture the word innovation in some sense. But there is a core question around democracy about why should the few rule for the many, and how do we constitutionalize our ideas around that. But in modernity, it's equally a question, why should the few know for the many? What is the role of the expert, and in what ways are we according expertise a kind of power that you know, itself ought to be questioned in some way? So I'll move to, you know, one more methodological point and then a couple of examples. So organizing concepts. I'm suggesting that to some degree, STS is doing the double loop here, not just beginning with questions about how do people come to believe new knowledge, and from there move on to questions of how does culture matter in the production of knowledge, but equally to begin with what matters in culture and then move backwards to think about how thought collectives, facts, systems of knowledge underwrite the ways in which cultural formations are being constructed. All right, so examples. This is Davos. I like the fact that in February of 1996, a declaration of independence was articulated in Davos, of all places, and that was the declaration of cyber independence by John Perry Barlow, more famous for his role in the Grateful Dead. But it's rhetorical and emancipatory. Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel. I come from the cyberspace, and you know, a rejection of sovereignty on the part of nation states. So it's a rejection of one form of constitutionalism. I mean, this isn't taken as a constitutional moment, but it should be taken as a constitutional moment. So we know that at least in America, digital companies have essentially been allowed to grow unregulated until quite recently, and it's only very recently that people are beginning to talk about limits. And yet, the fact that what they do is already overflowing the limits of what they think they can offer by way of regulation, that has been with us for a long time. So around the time that Facebook claimed that it was now something like the biggest nation on earth, Facebook Nation, it was already the case that Facebook's computer algorithms were not well managed because they didn't have people to look at content. And then if you start asking, well, what was the nature of the people that they had monitoring things, you would find a north-south relationship that's not very different from how it is in other forms of industrial capitalism. All right, so eventually Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, and I'm only using Facebook as an example, you could do this with other tech companies as well, and sometimes they've been there altogether. But Zuckerberg became sort of the face of the out-of-control tech para-state for some time, and it's worth looking at how this was happening. So this is a declaration of sovereignty. I mean, when the Cambridge Analytica crisis broke, the UK Parliament wanted to talk to Mark Zuckerberg, and he said no. And so, you know, who has the right to say no to somebody else's parliament, even if you're doing business in that person's country, right? I mean, so, you know, in effect, the actions speak like words. Pursues a federal privacy law on its own terms. So a legislative body that is doing something, asserting legislative prerogative, and eventually even the creation of a Facebook Supreme Court, you know, deciding disputes that Zuckerberg says he will be bound by. So in that constitution, what makes the Supreme Court legitimate is that Mark Zuckerberg, a majority owner of Facebook, says he will be bound by Facebook's declarations about content and about whether content should be allowed or regulated or whatever. Even the hiring of Nick Clegg, a former UK political leader, to be the public face of Facebook is interesting. Nearly a year after first endorsing the idea of Facebook's benevolent dictator, Mark Zuckerberg, is giving his empire a Supreme Court. So again, you see that the language of reporting, even in the media, is highly constitution inflected. So where is the Declaration of Independence? And if you go back and read the charges against the person against whom the Bill of Charges was originally brought, you see that some of the same kinds of claims are now being made about Facebook. He has refused his assent to laws. I mean, if you're confecting privacy laws on your own terms, you're obviously refusing assent in other ways. Forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance. So the non-regulation from inside is like that. Refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, you know, people demanding greater privacy protection, for instance, and called together legislative bodies at places, well, I don't know if they're uncomfortable, they're probably perfectly comfortable, but you have to be invited to them in the first place. Anyway, so there are interesting echoes from hundreds of years ago. And yet there are also stirrings of rebellion that are interesting to think about because they show that internally in these companies, people recognize the politics of what's going on. This is just one headline among many, but you could look at the unionization moves that are going on in these large digital companies as another kind of recognition that a constitutional moment has arrived in which people acting collectively can assert rights of a sort that didn't exist before. So what happens if we look through the lens of constitutionalism at these innovative moments? And I want to offer one other example to say, to pick up on that notion before that there is not a single way, but multiple ways. And that is where I want to conclude my initial provocation. So if you want to look at the constitutional, you have to ask, well, what is this about? And you can ask about, well, what kinds of subjects are we making in the constitutional order? What are the purposes for which this order is being constructed, and where does human agency fit into it? Those are at least some of the important questions. And again, you can go to legal disputes as a place where some of these questions are being articulated in the first instance. So one of the early cases that has had incredible resonance is the case brought by this gentleman in Spain, Marian Gonzalez, and you know, because he's a pretty ordinary bloke, there aren't that many pictures of him. I like the fact that he's looking so puzzled in this picture, like he doesn't know, you know, what he's going to be bringing about. So the man had been indebted at a certain point because he'd had some kind of marital and divorce troubles and had to borrow things or go into hock. But it so happened that although he was kind of a nobody or an everyman, every time anybody searched his name, it was the story of his indebtedness that would come up. So 16 years down the line, he decided he'd had enough of this. He didn't want to be known as a debtor for all time to come, and so he sued Google and said that you made this internet search engine. You are responsible for removing my name from it because you're now purveying completely wrong, irrelevant information about who I am and who I ought to be. So it's worth recalling that we've decided that how people are remembered in many cultures belongs with them, that this is a right of being, that you control your memory. And one of the most resonant of these reminders is in Stratford on the tomb of William Shakespeare. Good friend, for Jesus' sake, forbear to dig the dust and close it here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. So there's a sense of continuing license or non-license accorded over the mortal remains. And here we are with Mr. Gonzalez, who even with his present day remains, in a sense, the remains that are something trivial he did years back, isn't able to control what happens to his memory to the degree that Shakespeare thought he could control what happened to his bones, hundreds of years down the line. Now, if you think analogically, as lawyers do, you might say, well, okay, but there are lots of places in the law where we actually allow people to control their own futures into future time. But what's important is that we allow that control. It's a form of understood subjectivity that you can impose those controls. You can set up a trust, and it takes a very great effort of time and energy to break the trust, to get different language into it. So for instance, in this context, it's important that Cecil Rhodes's trust was written with an almost unbreakable clause that it was only men who would ever get Rhodes scholarships. And it took a strange conglomeration of parliamentary action and reinterpretation to start awarding Rhodes scholarships to women. But it's an example of a place where for dozens and hundreds, decades and decades, a trust was held to be inviolate as the will of the person continuing beyond their body. And these databases, biobanks, the whole idea of transhumanism are places where we have, in effect, allowed people to keep asserting a control over the way in which they are remembered, their will is articulated, and they have effect on the nature of the future. And yet, when the Google Spain case came up, two very distinguished scholars of the internet came to very different conclusions about what the outcome should be. So Victor Meyer-Schönberger, who's at the University of Oxford, was one of the architects of a right to be forgotten, the right to declare that you will not be remembered on the internet. But his American counterpart at Harvard said that this was a bad idea because it was going to judicialize decisions that really should be left to the self-regulation of the internet. How an individual's reputation is protected is too important and subtle a policy matter to be legislated by a high court. But note that he doesn't say it's too subtle to be legislated by the high court formed by Facebook. So, there's a certain kind of contradiction there that is left to be unraveled. But equally important, what Zittrain focuses in on is the protection of the person's reputation, whereas what Meyer-Schönberger focuses on is the evolution of the human. It's difficult to grow to change. So this is an idea of the development of the human as a right and to control the development of your own persona, which actually figures in constitutional law on the continent and civil law traditions, in a way does not in the common law tradition. So I think that this is a kind of place where you see different legal underpinnings actually leading to very different interpretations of what is the right way to go forward and who should have the power to make the rules in these circumstances. So you can talk about an American way with innovation, which is render the innovation natural. Of course, it was bound to happen, it's inevitable. You make it a thing of the market, because once the innovation has happened and it's a tool, of course, we should learn how to use it, and we should all pick it up, and then the market will take care of things. Make the benefits private, usually. Collectivize the risks. This is all sort of part of the unwritten technology policy of the US. Whereas, if you look at the European answer, you note from very early on the creation of a new kind of subjectivity that is connected to the data. It's interesting to me that the term data subject arises on the European side of these kinds of debates and not on the American side, because on the American side, we think that the rights that attach to the individual can be protected or not protected, and that's good enough. Whereas on the European side, there's more of a sense that subjectivity itself is at stake, and what kind of subjects we shall be in this world is itself in motion. And then the decision of the European Court of Justice gives the data subject some rights, may in addition rely and get rid of inadequate, irrelevant, or no longer relevant or excessive information. And so Mr. Gonzalez wins the day in that respect. Now, I think that this way of thinking does have some payoffs for thinking about politics, and these are very preliminary ideas because they all need much more work to spell them out. But what I'm suggesting is that this kind of comparative look at the reverse integration of technology, not starting with the fact or the artifact, but starting with the normative order and how does it speak back to the innovation, and doing it comparatively, alerts us to the underlying theories and cultures of public knowing, and indeed cultures of what human integrity even is, or what the meaning of being human is, that might not be perceptible to us otherwise. And that then allows us to go further and think about the ways in which we address that question of modernity. Why should the few be allowed to know for the many? Because we re-examine the principles of delegation, like, for instance, why we question the capacity of an actual legally ordained Supreme Court to judge whether a rule of privacy violation is meaningful or not. But we don't complain as much when Facebook organizes its own Supreme Court, right? I mean, there are principles of delegation at work in those very assumptions that we can excavate and we can think about further. And then from there, we go to the principles of accountability for the ways in which we reason in public about these things. And I hope that this is a place of fruitful future dialogue between the Foundation for Innovation and Democracy and the field of STS as it grapples with some of these same issues. So with that, let me thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Jasanoff. You actually took me to the early 20th century, around the 1920s, at the height of the advance in quantum physics and so on and so forth, the discovery of the atomic nucleus. I can quote from one mathematician who was a contemporary of Albert Einstein, talking about your reference to CERN and the gravitational waves, which at the time Einstein predicted. This gentleman was David Hilbert. When asked, he said, "Wer müssen wissen, wer willen wissen?" Loosely translated into English, it goes, "We must know, we will know," which of course countered ignoramus et ignorabimus. That is the high watermark of what I will call physics and mathematical positivism, which obviously gave us that kind of Promethean view of the world, which has been our philosophy, especially for us on the side of fundamental physics. Thanks for your provocation. But I leave it to Professor Achille Mbembe to utter a few words. But let me again thank you so much for your wonderful challenge. And now my pleasure to introduce Professor Achille Mbembe. Achille Mbembe is a research professor in history and politics here at the Wits Institute for Social Economic Research, and a director since 2021 of the Innovation Foundation for Democracy here at Wits. Among his colleagues, I won't go into detail. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a fellow of the British Academy. As you all know, is the social sciences equivalent of the Royal Society, if I may say so, and which is indeed a very highly prestigious learned society in the UK and the Commonwealth. His scholarly works include 10 books, and his work has been translated into 15 languages. His latest book is La Communication Terrestre, which was published in Paris by Les Tourlettes in 2023. Professor Mbembe, over to you to deliver your remarks.
Okay, it's always a pleasure to be introduced by the Vice Chancellor. It's brief, it's direct, and goes straight to the point. I would like to thank him for being with us here tonight. I would also like to thank Jorgen and Bjorn and Ellen for bringing the Holberg Prize to our shores, and I would like to add my congratulations to Sheila for not only her life work, but also the distinction she got last year, and the amazing presentation we have just followed. What I hope to do is to spend a little bit of time on two concerns that, as far as I understand, have figured prominently in an important part of Sheila's work. First is the concern with technological change, broadly speaking, and we saw a moment ago the way in which she reasons about this. So technological change, broadly speaking, and in particular the digital revolution, as well as its consequences, or if you want, its reverberations throughout all spheres of existence. And she has just given us a sample of some of these spheres of existence, including, of course, the legal, the commercial, the financial, and so forth and so on. So that's the first point of concern I would like to take with me, as I'm trying not really to respond to her, but to add to the basket of key issues she has gifted us with. The second concern, she didn't insist on it very explicitly tonight, but it's part of her work. The second concern is the fact that political theory has been somewhat slow, if not unable, to pick up on what these developments mean. Sheila, all that you have described and analyzed so pointedly. What it means not only for states, for citizens, but what it means for the global order, but also for we humans in our constitutive entanglement with non-humans, to put it simply. So these are the 2 points of concern I would like to speak to briefly. I will then say a few words on the question of whether we have indeed entered a new era of globalism, and if so, what actually defines it? Or to put it somewhat philosophically, whether we have crossed some kind of a threshold, consigning in the process the idea of human uniqueness to history, which Sheila was gesturing towards in her comments on sovereignty and the dissented nature of sovereignty nowadays, or the fact that humans, quoting the High Judge of the U.S. Court, are now saddled with their technical objects, which have become part of their anatomy. And I will end with brief comments on what Sheila has called constitutional thinking, which I understand as a way of instituting a different relationship between knowledge and power, a different relationship in the ongoing search for visions of human flourishing and welfare, in the ongoing search to, if you want, to render our planet habitable. So she entered this debate with questions of constitution. I would like to enter it with questions surrounding our habitability in this planet at this time. So, to begin with, a few fundamental questions raised in the midst of our technological present. It seems to me that, and Sheila has demonstrated it here tonight, as well as in a huge part of her work, that technologies are giving rise to unprecedented transformations, which are obviously redefining contemporary notions of work and play, politics and finance, economics, culture. But that's not all. It seems to me that we are witnessing evolution in everything in and around us, in the sense that technologies are also folding into the human itself. They are not just extending the human outwards, they are also folding into the human itself. They are extending the material organization of our environment, our modes of sentience, our styles of thought, the capacities for communication provided by language, by memory. She ended up with this important question of memory. Semantic and symbolic worlds we have inherited from the past. Now, of course, whether old categories such as subject, self, or even sovereignty, Sheila, or individual, whether they are still capable of accounting for these transformations is unclear to me. And I would be very happy to hear you speak a bit more about this, since indeed you referred to such important notions. I'm just wondering whether we still really gain a lot in holding on to them. Now, a second thing which strikes me is the extent to which, and you mentioned it, intelligence is now migrating to places we didn't think it belonged to. Let me just put it in that way. This is the case, clearly, whether we are talking about reproductive technologies, whether we are talking about synthetic gene therapies, whether we are talking about linguistic and robotic intelligence, or whether we are referring to the technological advances from genetic manipulation, brain-computer interfaces, neuroprosthetics, and robotics, and all the machines with which we now live. Now live surrounded by all kinds of machines. Cloud machines, geoengineering and emotive devices and apparatuses, transportation machines. Wherever we look, we are besieged by machines. And in fact, it is almost certain, it seems to me that, but you can correct me, that today the growth of machine intelligence might be hamstrung by various ideologies of artificial intelligence. And I use the term ideologies of artificial intelligence for very good reasons. These ideologies, I think, are in turn harbored by misconceptions about what is and is not artificial. What is and is not intelligent. I think we have to reopen that discussion. We have to ask once again, what is artificial and what is not? Because in philosophy, the response is not that self-evident. And what is intelligence and what is not? I think this discussion is, most of the times, clouded by multiple anthropomorphic biases and presumptions which have left us somewhat with inadequate allegories for the things that machine intelligence does accomplish. Why do I say this? I say this because in some philosophical traditions, the artificial refers to something that merely resembles an original. I think we should be pursuing synthetic intelligence, not artificial intelligence. The synthesis of human and machine intelligence in pursuit of insights, in pursuit of creativity, that would be impossible for either on their own. And insights and creativity, the function of which is to render the planet habitable again. Come back to this question of habitability. Then, a third point I would like to put on the table has to do with the fact that, the ways in which our ways of thinking about, our ways of intervening upon, and being human persons are changing in the light, of course, of research, current research on human evolution, animal sentience, and so forth. And therefore, there are a number of specific questions of ethics and politics that these changes raise. And Sheila introduced us to some of them. I think it's a line of inquiry we should pursue even more strongly. Now, let me move to the other question, which I think is, we find a lot in Sheila's work. I mentioned it when I said that political theory has been pretty slow in its appraisal of these transformations. It has been slow because of many reasons, of course. The main one, I think, is that it has not understood that what we call the information society is an inadequate name for an event. And I really use the concept of the event here in its deepest philosophical sense. An event of geophilosophical magnitude. What is that event? It's the emergence of a new form of intelligence represented by planetary scale computation. I think, in addition, of course, to evolving countless animal, vegetal, microbial species, the Earth has been recently evolved a kind of smart exoskeleton, which makes it such that, in fact, we live in two Earths nowadays. We live in the old Earth, old soil we knew of, with its physical properties, but we live in a new Earth, which are called an exoskeleton, which is just as important as the first, and which makes us evolve in a kind of bifurcated cosmology, the properties of which I don't really have the time to insist upon here, but this seems to me to be a very important development in our recent history. And the emergence of these planetary scale computation, this new form of intelligence, I think makes it possible and even necessary to conceive an intentional, a self-conscious, directed politics. The vision for which is not to be found in computing infrastructure itself, in techno-solutionism. It must be found in the purposes to which we put it. Thus, once again, the question of planetary habitability. Now, many might ask the question, okay, what is it that using the term planetary adds to the discussion? It seems to me that the concept of the planetary implicates, of course, deep time. It names the depth of biological and inorganic interrelations. But more interestingly, it offers an understanding of the Earth with capital E, not so much as a world in the phenomenological sense, but the geologic, or if you want, the bio-geochemical sense. In the sense, too, of the habitat of particular species. And I use species here in the plural, humans and other entities. So I think we can take seriously the fact that for contemporary philosophy, the concept of the planetary and its corollary planetarity has been put forward as an alternative to the global, an expired notion that is static, that is somewhat flattened, that is Eurocentric. It is also different from the international. The planetary, if you want, is, as far as I can see, the name of of the project before us as we contemplate how to preserve, how to curate, and extend complex life. And that's the point I wanted really to put on the table, the question of complex life. What it means today to live complex lives. And what the demands are in terms of forms of knowledge that might allow us indeed to look for new possibilities of ecology. Now, let me end this by then developing, let's say, the hypothesis that a more aspirational goal, if you want, would be to contribute to the composition and enforcement of a shared future. That's, if you want, the ultimate end of technology. I'm now talking about what it is that, if we want to do a critique of technology, what is it for? What should it aspire to? Should it aspire to precisely the comprehension and composition and enforcement of a shared future, a future that is more rich, diverse, and viable because it is composed out of expanded landscapes of life. But not only expanded landscapes of life, expanded landscapes of personhood. And this is where Africa has a lot to offer. It has a lot to offer because we have relied for too long on a single archive, the European archive. When you look, for instance, at the archive put forward by Kantian philosophers, for them, only humans have genuine autonomy because only humans have language, they have self-consciousness so as to define their own ends and be aware of them at all. But it's not just Kantians who like to draw hard and fast lines between humans and others. We might contrast Africa's pluralist appreciation of the multiple varieties of personhood with, for instance, that epitome of European philosophy, Heidegger, who insisted that there were barrier-like distinctions between dead things, mere animals, and genuine humans, that animals, and presumably those humans who, for racial reasons, were poor in world, and that only genuine humans were world-forming. When you look at African systems of thought, they start from an entirely different premise. What Africa teaches us is that personhood does not simply apply to humans. Humans are not the only ones who have language or who can respond to each other, who can be addressed and who can reply. In African systems of thought, it is persons that are world-forming. So the question, end there, of what it is to be a fully human person is the kind of questions we have to address at this juncture to technology. As a way of highlighting the reality of the vital existence of human persons, the complex vital infrastructures that are required to sustain personhood, to support and sustain the different modalities of living human persons in our world today. This idea of being a finite human person, struggling to make a life, to create and sustain a milieu for that life in an often hostile and forgiving world, it seems to me that these are the questions we have to ask addressed to technology as we enter this new century. Thank you very much. Thanks again, Sheila, for the richness of what you had to offer us.
Thank you, Professor Mbembe, for your wonderful reflections that as we move towards the Q&A and the conversation, just made my mind's eye go back to famous reflection on technology by H.G. Wells, culminating in a movie, film by Stanley Kubrick, 2001 Space Odyssey, in which actually you have that interplay between the human and the machine out in space, running away from Earth. Of course, HAL does go rogue. And of course, a few years later in recent times, where the human beings, Professor Mbembe, the planetary survival is also questioned because now they find themselves in the matrix where they've had to basically squash the Earth and reconnect to the real world through scorched earth policy. And by the way, there are no animals in the matrix. That's interesting. And so it's a question of, what it is to be human in the era of that. So therefore, to me, what's surprising is that all these things that we as scientists have worked on writing algorithms actually were originated in a way. There's a prescience of the creatives, either in form of the Wachowski brothers or the of H.G. Wells, who was interpreted by Stanley Kubrick. So this is a wonderful way, on a lighter movie note, to now have a conversation with our distinguished scholars here. So we'll just open the platform. Where do I sit? In the middle, right? Yeah. As I move closer here, just to ask Professor Jasanoff, before I do that, let me first thank you both, Professor Jasanoff and Professor Mbembe, for the wonderful conversation that's about to begin, and for your wonderful summation, Professor Mbembe, and your provocation, Professor Jasanoff. A round of applause. I'll just start with you, Professor Jasanoff, and ask you to share your thoughts or two about Professor Mbembe's remarks.
Thank you. Well, Achille, that was such a wide-ranging set of concerns that we could be here forever. But to distill a couple of things, you asked about the place of intelligence, the place of the planetary, the place of complexity, and then maybe woven through that, through all of those things, the specialness of the human, if any. And of course, you also alluded to the fact that answers to any of these questions are to some degree place-based, because you suggested that there are African ways of thinking about some of these things. So let me take the intelligence point. And it's worth remembering that intelligence has been a topic of discussion, what it is and who has it and how we measure it and how we simulate it and build it for really a very long time. And two developments that run to some degree counter to one another are apparent in our own time. So one of them is the kind of intelligence that's encoded into AI, and I would call that a move towards a singularity of intelligence. It's not actually surprising that the word singularity itself has been suggested as a kind of endpoint for what happens when all of human intelligences are buckled onto one another and we're able to think like a billion people all at once. The other day I heard a talk by Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, and he was predicting, what the world would look like, the world of AI, in 3 to 5 years. And he said that he imagined, and this will be of particular interest to you, Vice Chancellor, that we all would have an assistant by our elbow, an AI assistant, that would, at the very moment that you're thinking of the next thing in your field, be summarizing everything that has already been thought up to that moment. So he was imagining this amazing machine sitting there by your elbow, sort of feeding you. I mean, I don't even know what this imagination was, a sort of gigantic fail-safe Wikipedia that you don't even need to look at or what. But what struck me was the was the we that was embedded in there. Because, first of all, it was a very white-collar imagination. The AI sitting by your elbow, I'm not quite sure what a blue-collar worker on an assembly line would be doing with that AI assistant. Probably that job would have been taken away altogether. But then where would that blue-collar worker go if within 3 to 5 years they've been laid off? So it struck me that the imagination was already extremely class-ridden in ways that were not being explored. So, you know, it's just one example of what I mean about the sort of implicit singularity built into the way in which generative AI is being thought about as something that enters our world. But at the same time, in the field of education and education studies and the politics of education, there's been a diversification of the idea of intelligence. So at Harvard, one of my distinguished colleagues is a professor named Howard Gardner, who has written about intelligence. I mean, that's one of his topics. And the point he makes over and over again is that intelligence is multiple, and that we don't have all the forms of intelligence at the same time. And he distinguishes, for instance, between musical intelligence and spatial intelligence and verbal intelligence and quantitative intelligence, but also emotional intelligence. And it's interesting that even in popular parlance, the EQ has emerged as a side-by-side entity along with IQ, so much so that you're supposed to know that EQ means emotional, a quotient of emotional intelligence, and it's also quite widely accepted that some markers of very high IQ don't always go with equally high markers of EQ. So, you know, so just to put on the table that these are contradictory movements in the sciences, in the ways in which we understand human beings at the same time. And I think that the way in which the makers of AI are thinking about the set of issues is a very particular form of intelligence. If you talk to them, they will immediately say, you know, we're talking about statistics, we're talking about the capacity to make a prediction about what the next step would be if all the steps up to that point had been in a certain way. So far, I have not received an adequate answer to my question that when an AI that's consulted on legal matters and hallucinates and gives you a fake case, how does it actually name the case? I mean, I can kind of understand how they fake the cases and the holdings, but I'm not quite sure how they decide on the actual nomenclature of the case that they spit out in their hallucination. But anyway, I mean, these are sort of interesting questions. But I think we should beware of being seduced by the singular vision of intelligence when a lot of our other energies are geared toward saying that equality as a value that we want should not depend on the singularity of intelligence. So I think, for instance, again, because my university happens to be in the news so much, the lawsuit about affirmative action and, you know, what kind of people should Harvard admit, to some degree centers on the question of how do we measure the capability and are we using the right measures at all or not. And I think one danger of narrowing one's sort of ontological idea of intelligence is that we actually squeeze out the margins and squeeze out the variation when we don't actually understand that picture very well at all. I mean, one last thing I'll say about it is that I think one of the messages of Ishiguro's novel, Clara and the Sun, is about that squeezing out. I mean, so he also wrote the book on genetic modification before, but in the Clara and the Sun book, all the children have already been, quote, lifted, unquote, which is genetically engineered to be very similar, and they are behaving like the robots in a sense, and the robot is behaving like the human. Now, you can read it multiple ways. You can say that this is an invitation to do the kind of thing that you were urging, which is, or that I thought you were urging, which is to think in a more hybridized or more complex mode about the relationship between humans and machines. But you could also read it as a cautionary tale about what happens when you take certain attributes of the human and extend those attributes at the expense of other things that you may not understand and how they go side by side. So that's one thing I'll say. Another is about the planetary level. I mean, as no doubt you know, I think about this a lot of the time and, you know, what planetary sustainability is. But what I'd love to hear you say more about is for whom question, which I think is where you ended up with the points about human flourishing and the, you know, the sort of what sorts of futures are we going to imagine. So one of the pieces of field work I did shortly before the COVID pandemic hit was visit a very large solar power plant, a solar development in the state of Karnataka near Bangalore. And, you know, talk about planetary sustainability. You're taking vast acres of land and converting them to look identical. And it's these solar panels. I have to say that in spite of being an environmental scholar, I had never really thought in detail about the sheer construction infrastructure that's needed to sustain, talk about sustainability, those panels, and that the earth that you're converting into a platform for hundreds of thousands of solar panels never, or with only very great difficulty, will ever be rendered suitable if some other technological development were to come through that could, for instance, think about the fertility of soil in a different way. So the thought I had when I saw this solar park was that it was the nearest thing to sowing soil with dragon's teeth that I have ever seen in my life. And then these solar panels sort of grew up as the orcs of our lives. I mean, you know, but you know, that in effect we're creating certain kinds of monstrosities in the effort to solve other kinds of monstrosities. And at least for the locals, life was more sustainable, even if irregular, uncertain, often deprived, than when they're now lacking any kind of employment, because like those truck drivers that are going to be driven out of business by the self-driving trucks, they actually don't have anything to do at the moment. And, you know, so what forms of creativity are being leashed or unleashed by these developments that we're putting together in the, you know, in the thought of the planetary we? And India, after all, is one of these places where many of the most innovative ideas for how to do environmental movements has emerged. And so you could think of the Chipko movement, which was the tree huggers movement, as a normative demonstration that people see a connection between human forms of life and other forms of life. But in the interests of what? I mean, why have these great movements in India, like the Narmada movement and the Chipko movement, originated at all? And you see that it's, to some degree, opposing a sense of development that is also acting in a well-intentioned way about the planetary we, but doing it in a way that levels diversity, ignores the local, or at least reinscribes the local or reinterprets the local within the terms of the parables of their own ideas about creation, destruction, and so on and so forth. So I think that if one is to take your invitation seriously, one would have to go back into the cosmologies of different locations and be quite careful about not importing a cosmology of one place onto another as one thinks about these questions of progress, development, and sustainable planetary existence. So I think we're on the same page with our concerns, and I don't have any answers.
No, but
I want to reflect on that before we just go to...
Yes, no, but just one word. I think Sheila ended very well. I agree precisely with her last pronouncement on the importance of taking very seriously local cosmologies. Question of whether cosmologies are incommensurable, meaning that they cannot be shared is also, of course, a serious matter. I believe that they will live at a time when they can be shared. Maybe they were not before. In fact, they were in many different ways. But more than ever, it seems to me that the urgency of the moment forces us somewhat to imagine what those shared cosmologies could be. And this search for shareable cosmologies, I think, should start from the very reality of our constitutive entanglement with the entirety of the creation. I don't have another word for that, except that rather theological concept of creation.
Wow, I'm provoked because as a physicist, I believe in one cosmology, universalist cosmology with a kind of one creative point that is a singularity, where all laws of nature break down. It's 1/0. That's what physicists think about in mathematical physics. The singularity is a point where you cannot explain, either in a black hole or at the beginning of time. But that's another story for another conversation. I just fascinated by the use of language. We'll take a few questions just then before we have reflections, and depending on time, we'll take another round. Is there a roving mic there? And I think you've got a lot of very first-hand ground for incredible reflections. Professor Breckenjit, Keith, at the back there. I might not know some of you, especially the younger people here. Please introduce yourselves.
Yeah, thank you both for very stimulating talks. I think the question is, it's partly about how to fit the bad-tempered state back into this. Of course, I'm going to ask this question. And I'm thinking in particular about the way the Chinese Communist Party has shifted on this since 2019, I mean, the year or so before COVID. So they issued a white paper, I think it was in 2018, I was trying to look it up, I can't remember. They were going to teach grade 1 students machine learning. The whole society was going to orient towards machine learning. And then Xi basically, at some point, somebody made a decision and said, we're not going to do this anymore. So they've clearly decided that AI is a kind of fundamental risk, probably to the party, but I think philosophically they might be right that it's actually a risk to all of us. And that is it's a really fundamental change. It reminds me, Andrew Ng, who used to be the head of AI at Baidu, he used to say, AI will never work in America because Americans don't follow the rules. You know, they basically cross the roads in the wrong place, and they tease the AI systems, and the poor cars don't know what to do. But in China, people know what to do. They follow the rules, and AI will work there. But in fact, something like the opposite has happened, and very quickly in the last 2 or 3 years, we've ended up with Americans saying, really in a completely unconstrained way, America's future depends on AI. And the Chinese saying this is a danger and a threat. So I'm for both of you, for Sheila, I'm wondering how you fit the CCP into the model of constitutionalism. And for Achille, I'm wondering about, you know, the limits of your interest in the non-human. And are we really saying that we should be looking at embracing what everyone calls as the life, the rights, the being of the AI creatures? Because I think we're close to the point at which there actually will be things that we can talk about as being non-human beings that exist in this AI domain.
2 questions are summarized: non-human beings existing in the AI, and the CCP and the legal aspect of it. We'll take one comment, just 3, then I'm sure that my colleagues will capture that, and then you reflect.
Hi, good evening. It's Samgelo. I'm a student here, international relations. My question, I think, goes back to what Professor Jasanoff spoke on the age of infantilization. I think you spoke on that. And I come into it, the other day I was listening to Ukhozi, a Zulu radio station here, and they were talking about, so they had brought these ward counselors, and they were teaching them coding and some coding and artificial intelligence and all this virtual reality and all of that. But at the same time, in the background, I mean, there was a report that 60 or 70% of these ward counselors can't read or write, you know. So here they are, they brought them in a room and they're teaching about coding, and of course they're doing it in Zulu to get to them. And I was wondering how then this, of course, the age of infantilization, because some of them are old, you know, they come from that other era of governance where it's an inherited government from the tribal administrative and stuff. But I was wondering how this age of infantilization refashions itself in the global south, you know, the double infantilization that happens there. You know, of course, there's too many gaps that happens, but how does it reimagine itself in the global south? Particularly because it's the othering of the other already. You know, they're already on the other side, and how does it fashion itself there? Thanks.
That's a fantastic question. Just maybe to put in the South African context, a ward is a sub-district of a county, right? So these are people who actually are selected by a small part of the local municipality to represent at either town or city level. And what Samugelo said is that most of them are non-native English speakers, and therefore they were being taught coding AI. So he spoke about double infantilization. I thought I'd just put it in the local context what the ward is, yeah. So I'm sure that you've captured that, Prof. Jasanoff. I'm sure you can handle another question. Going. Tenepa.
Actually, this is a very quick comment to do with indigenous languages, because one of the most interesting things is that when you try and use indigenous languages, like South Africa's indigenous languages, using artificial intelligence, it actually reveals that artificial intelligence is not very intelligent. Because many of the indigenous languages have got things like compound nouns, so words that are made up of other words. Artificial intelligence tends to read that as a sentence and then gives you a sentence instead of giving you the equivalent English word. And then you're like, oh, well, you're not that intelligent after all. So actually, in fact, indigenous languages have the potential to be used as sort of litmus tests for artificial intelligence, because they actually show that the thing cannot understand intention, because the indigenous languages, the word, the meaning of the word depends on your intention. What are you intending to say? And artificial intelligence seems to not be able to understand intention. So I'll give an example for Zulu speakers. A word like sofa silahlane, which means like a dear object that you are not going to part with till the day you die. If you put that in Google Translate, it says, it is broken, or it comes up with like a sentence, which is like, no, that's not what the word means. In English, it cannot find the English equivalent of what is a dear thing that I am only going to part with when I die. In Zulu, it's one word. In English, there is no such word. So I actually think that indigenous languages are actually potentially a kind of litmus test. I just wanted to comment back on this comment about isiZulu and ChatGPT and artificial intelligence.
Okay. I've just been informed that we are running out of time, so I'll leave it to Professor Mbembe to respond to the question that was asked by Professor Beckenridge, and for the two questions for you, Professor Jasanoff.
What to say, Keith? I mean, the limits of the non-human. I would start from the reverse assumption that the non-human is limitless, precisely, as opposed to the human. And it's because of that limitlessness that it fits so uneasily with any form of calculative reason, with the idea that everything is calculable. In fact, the non-human world, what it teaches us is that not everything is calculable. I have in mind, I mean, Sheila was mentioning a novel a moment ago. I have in mind another one by Amos Tutuola, which is really a treatise on what we call artificial intelligence, but I was arguing for different kind of intelligence, which is synthetic intelligence, which means different forms of, or different modalities of articulating expertise, recognizing forms of agency, acting upon the world in the most efficient manner. It is a treatise on that. And what I take from it, in one word, is the limitlessness of what we call here the non-human world, and the inability either of machines or of humans themselves to calculate it. Thus the importance of learning how to live with, let's say, the inability to calculate, and developing capabilities of composing precisely with the multitude and plurality of forms and ways of being, which seems to me to be a better philosophy than philosophies of sovereignty, which rest on the drive to conquer, to control, and to subjugate.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. 2 questions for you.
Well, let me take a crack at all 3, beginning with the comment about indigenous languages. Was the people who are developing these AI models, they would say, we have an answer to your problem. The real problem is not that the machine is stupid, but that the database of these other languages is just not big enough, and English has had the chance, because it's an imperial language, to be able to train machines to have a far larger basis from which to start. So the answer is just do more of it, and eventually things will catch up. And there are places like, for instance, Spain, that have adopted that as the solution. That is, what we need to develop is an independent Spanish database that now draws in Latin America and Spain into a single orbit. I mean, so which language is indigenous? Inside the EU, lots of people feel that if they're non-Anglophone, then they're indigenous as well. So, I think that's a point about the sort of statistical prevalence of one language more than others that the machine learners think they know how to correct for. But I wonder about the sort of wider implications of your point that you're making. On the local, people who can't read and yet are being taught to code, I mean, another of the experiences in the Apartheid Museum was being told again about the Bantu Education Act and the sort of purposeful creation of differently educated strata in society. And we know that this is a technique of divide and conquer that people have known for a long time and used for a long time. So even the creation of esoteric religious languages so that only a priestly caste would know what they are. I mean, is that so different from coding language and who is a great software engineer? I mean, maybe we are producing those priestly castes in some sense. But I think again, the sort of response to that is to some degree historicize and to some degree politicize, as I think you're implying. I mean, it is interesting to see who the new laboring classes are of this digital age. So for instance, who are the people distinguishing pornography from non-pornography, and what is the psychic effect that it's having when people are looking at one violent image after another in the effort to, displace the machine. I mean, these laborers, I can assure you, are not the Harvard graduates or the Yale graduates or whatever. They're being hired at much lower rates. So I think you're pointing to a much greater problem about the re-stratification of the labor market around this new production system that has a high end and a low end, and we just don't know who the equivalent of the blue-collar workers are to quite the same degree that we do about other systems of production. So again, it's a very important problem that I think you're pointing to. And then, Keith, so you know, my claims about constitutionalism and why it's important to think this way are not about saying somebody has a better constitution than another. It's to, in fact, if anything, to become more modest about claims of constitutional order and to ask questions rather than assume that we know. So I don't myself have any idea what, in fact, Jay and I were talking about the fact that she is one of the world leaders who is the most opaque to us. I mean, you know, to some sense, to some degree, I can kind of understand Putin, but I cannot understand Xi. I mean, you know, it's just some things are more black box than others, and if you can, then you're in a far better position because China's a big place and you understand it better. But I think the point is more to see examples of the sort that you're discussing and to use them as entry points for understanding in some sense. And I'll just conclude by saying that a few years ago, a student of mine did a comparative study of the first incorporation of computers into education in 3 countries, US, France, and the then Soviet Union. And everything was different. And her finding, not surprising for a student of mine, was that underlying ideas of what good citizenship is drove the incorporation of the computer in a certain sense. So in the US, every school, you know, down to kindergarten levels practically, got equipped with computers very early on, and kids were taught and trained to play with them. In France, they were put into collective places where citizens could go and play with them, but in much more of a collectivized place so that it fitted with the idea of producing a unitary French citoyenship through the ways in which computers were being incorporated. And in the Soviet Union, the kids did not actually get any access to the machine at all, but instead learned simulation and modeling in very abstract and mathematized ways. And this spoke to, you know, the ways in which education and citizenship in a broader sense were being configured. And it seems to me the fable you're telling, or the story you're telling about China is a similar sort of thing. I mean, why does the CCP decide that not machine learning and not AI, but this other way will make you a better citizen of the communist state? And that's a very eye-opening kind of finding, but the sort of thing precisely that a comparatist would be trying to understand better.
Wonderful, colleagues. As it brings to a close, let me just summarize by saying that all of the above, in a reductionist way, which is physicist way, is, you know, it's from outsourcing our physical being to the beast of burden, to the machines in the industrial period. Now we've outsourced our brains to the machine. Ego. So with that, I'd like to thank once again our 2 distinguished speakers here, Professor Jasanoff and Professor Mbembe, please, for a wonderful and stimulating conversation. Thank you. Indeed, ladies and gentlemen, all this justifies us hosting this 2023 SA Conversations here at VETS. It's our hope that it's not a once-off. To quote from Victor Hugo, it's not the end, nor the beginning, but the end of the beginning. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful rest of the workshop.
Thank you so much.